September 1976. Night has fallen over London, but the lights are still on inside the Treasury. Files are stacked across desks. Telegraph machines hum quietly. Outside, the city moves as if nothing is wrong. But inside these rooms, Britain is running out of options. The pound is falling. Confidence is gone. And for the first time in generations, the British government is preparing to do something unthinkable. Not surrender territory, not admit military defeat, but ask for permission to survive. Within weeks, Britain will turn to an international institution designed for struggling nations and accept conditions that will reshape its economy for decades. This is not announced as a collapse. It is presented as responsibility, discipline, necessity. But behind closed doors, something else is happening. A line is being crossed. To understand why 1976 mattered, you have to understand what Britain believed it still was. 3 decades earlier, the country emerged from the Second World War exhausted but victorious. Its empire was shrinking, but its global role felt intact. London remained a financial center. Sterling was still treated as a serious currency. The welfare state expanded. Nationalized industries promised stability and jobs. Britain did not see itself as fragile. It saw itself as managing a difficult transition. Through the 1950s and early 1960s, growth lagged behind rivals. But the system held. Governments changed. Policies shifted. The assumption remained the same. Britain controlled its own economic destiny. That assumption quietly eroded. By the late 1960s, structural problems were impossible to ignore. Productivity was weak. Industrial investment lagged. Trade deficits persisted. The pound came under repeated pressure, forcing painful devaluations and emergency measures. Each crisis was treated as temporary. Each fix bought time. None addressed the core imbalance between what Britain promised at home and what it could sustain in a changing global economy. Then came the shocks of the 1970s. The collapse of the post-war monetary system removed the old anchors. Oil prices surged. Inflation accelerated. Wages chased prices in a vicious spiral. Strikes spread across key industries. Growth slowed while costs exploded. By the middle of the decade, Britain was trapped between competing dangers: cut spending and risk mass unemployment and social unrest. Keep spending and watch inflation and currency collapse accelerate. Governments tried to manage both. They failed. In 1974, a new administration returned to power, promising stability and social protection. It inherited an economy already strained and soon faced conditions it could not control. Inflation moved into double digits. The trade balance deteriorated. Confidence in sterling weakened week by week. International markets noticed. In an era of free-moving capital, belief mattered. Investors no longer judged Britain by its past. They judged it by its numbers. And those numbers looked increasingly dangerous. By 1976, the pressure became relentless. Sterling slid sharply on foreign exchange markets. Each fall made imports more expensive. Each drop fed inflation. Each headline reinforced the sense that Britain was losing control. The government attempted reassurance. Publicly, ministers insisted the situation was manageable. Privately, officials warned that reserves were draining at alarming speed. Emergency loans were considered. Currency interventions attempted. None restored confidence. What made the situation more dangerous was not just economics, it was perception. Britain was no longer seen as a special case. It was being treated like any other country with high inflation, weak growth, and a vulnerable currency. That shift mattered, because the institution watching most closely was the International Monetary Fund. The IMF was created to stabilize global finance. But by the 1972, It had developed a reputation. Its assistance came with conditions. Tight conditions. Countries that turned to the fund did not just receive money. They accepted oversight, targets, restrictions. For Britain, that carried a psychological weight. IMF programs were associated with struggling economies, not with former imperial powers, not with countries that still spoke the language of global leadership. Yet as sterling continued to fall, the options narrowed. By late summer, internal discussions turned explicit. If confidence could not be restored soon, Britain would be unable to finance its deficits. Imports could be disrupted. The pound could fall into freefall. Inflation could spiral beyond control. At that point, the choice would no longer be political. It would be mechanical, borrow or collapse. This is where the story often becomes simplified. Later narratives would claim the IMF forced Britain into austerity. Others would argue the conditions merely formalized decisions already necessary. The truth is more uncomfortable. Britain entered negotiations knowing the price, and accepted it anyway. Because by 1976, sovereignty was already constrained, not by tanks or treaties, but by markets. The first major turning point came not with the signing of an agreement, but with the admission that Britain could not stabilize itself alone. That admission was never put to a vote. It was handled quietly, technically, almost bureaucratically. But once made, it could not be undone. The moment Britain asked for help, the balance of power shifted. And the consequences would reach far beyond the crisis of 1976, shaping how the country would govern, spend, and define responsibility for a generation to come. The request was framed carefully. Britain was not collapsing, officials insisted. It was adjusting. Temporary assistance would calm markets. Discipline would restore confidence. Growth would return. But inside the negotiations, the language was far less comforting. Once discussions with the IMF began, the focus shifted immediately from reassurance to control. Numbers mattered more than narratives. Targets replaced promises. And every assumption about how Britain ran its economy was placed under scrutiny. The fund's concern was not political stability or social cohesion. It was credibility. Inflation had to fall. Public borrowing had to be reduced. Spending had to be restrained, not next year, but now. For British officials, this created a collision between economic reality and political identity. Since the war, successive governments had treated full employment and expanding public services as non-negotiable. Even when growth slowed, the state absorbed pressure through borrowing and intervention. The IMF did not accept that logic. From its perspective, Britain's problem was structural indiscipline. High spending fueled inflation. Inflation weakened the currency. A weak currency destroyed confidence. And without confidence, nothing else mattered. The solution, in IMF terms, was straightforward. Cut the deficit, limit wage growth, reduce state spending. The question was how far Britain would go and how publicly. Negotiations unfolded behind closed doors, but the stakes were enormous. The size of the requested loan was unprecedented for a country like Britain. So were the conditions attached. Draft proposals demanded deep cuts across public programs. Defense spending was examined, industrial subsidies questioned, social services scrutinized, line by line. For ministers, this was explosive. A government elected to protect jobs and services was being asked to dismantle them. Party divisions deepened. Trade unions watched nervously. Leaks to the press intensified political pressure. Publicly, the crisis was still described as manageable. Privately, officials acknowledged the margin for maneuver was disappearing. What made the situation even more sensitive was the international context. This was the height of the Cold War. Britain was still presented as a major Western power. A visible IMF bailout risked signaling weakness not just economically, but strategically. That fear shaped how the deal was constructed. The government sought to minimize public visibility. The fund pushed for measurable guarantees. Each side maneuvered carefully, aware that trust once lost would not return quickly. Markets were watching every rumor. Sterling continued to wobble. Each delay fed speculation that Britain would either reject conditions or fail to implement them. Either outcome threatened disaster. By early autumn, the pressure reached a breaking point. Senior officials warned that without an agreement, reserves would fall to dangerous levels. Imports could be disrupted. Emergency controls might be required. At that stage, austerity ceased to be a choice. It became the price of survival. The final package, agreed in principle before full public disclosure, marked a profound shift in British economic governance. Spending ceilings were imposed. Borrowing limits were tightened. Policy autonomy was constrained by external oversight. The government retained formal authority, but its room to act was sharply reduced. What mattered most was not just the cuts themselves, but the precedent. For the first time in modern British history, domestic economic policy was explicitly shaped by conditions set outside the country. This was not occupation, not coercion by force. It was compliance driven by necessity. Supporters of the deal argued it restored discipline and credibility. They pointed to falling inflation and stabilizing markets as evidence. Critics saw something else. They saw a quiet transfer of power from elected institutions to financial constraints enforced from abroad. And they warned that once accepted, this framework would be difficult to escape, because austerity, once normalized, tends to persist. Departments learned to operate under permanent restraint. Investment was deferred. Infrastructure aged. Long-term planning gave way to short-term balance. The IMF deal did not invent these pressures, but it locked them into policy. Equally important was the psychological shift. Britain stopped thinking of itself as an exception. It began to behave like a country that must constantly prove its credibility to external observers. That mindset reshaped future debates. Whenever spending increased, markets were invoked. Whenever investment was proposed, inflation fears followed. Whenever alternatives were raised, 1976 was remembered. Not as a moment of collapse, but as a warning. By the time the full details of the agreement became public, the immediate crisis had eased. Sterling stabilized. The headlines softened, but the deeper consequences were only beginning. The escalation of events had produced a bargain that saved Britain from immediate financial breakdown at the cost of narrowing its economic sovereignty, and the bill for that bargain would be paid slowly, unevenly, and largely out of public sight. The breaking point was still ahead, because austerity does not remain technical for long. Eventually, it reaches people. The effects did not arrive all at once. At first, the IMF deal appeared to work. Markets calmed. Sterling stabilized. Inflation began to slow. The immediate danger passed, and with it the sense of emergency that had justified extraordinary measures. But beneath that surface calm, the consequences were spreading. Austerity is rarely experienced as a single event. It is felt as accumulation. Deferred repairs, cancelled projects, hiring freezes, services stretched thinner year after year. What began as a temporary stabilization tool hardened into a governing framework. This was the breaking point, not a crash, but a transformation. Public spending limits reshaped priorities across government. Long-term investment gave way to short-term restraint. Infrastructure plans were shelved. Industrial modernization stalled. The logic of scarcity became permanent. Those who benefited were not immediately obvious. Financial markets rewarded discipline. International confidence improved. Britain's reputation as a responsible economy was slowly rebuilt. For external observers, the lesson was clear. Britain had accepted the rules. For many inside the country, the experience was different. Unemployment rose as industries adjusted under pressure. Regions already struggling felt the cuts most sharply. Communities dependent on public investment faced decline that was gradual then entrenched. The promise that austerity would be brief faded. What made the moment decisive was how it reframed political debate. Before 1976, economic arguments centered on choices: growth versus redistribution, investment versus consumption. After the IMF deal, debates increasingly began with constraints. What could markets tolerate? What would investors accept? What risks could be taken? The range of acceptable policy narrowed. This was not imposed by law. It was enforced by memory. 1976 became a reference point, invoked whenever expansion was proposed. It was cited as proof that deviation invited punishment. That discipline was not ideological preference, but economic necessity. In that sense, the IMF deal achieved something deeper than budget cuts. It reshaped expectations. Trade unions, once central actors in economic planning, found their leverage reduced. Wage restraint became a priority not just for competitiveness, but for credibility. Bargaining power shifted. The state's role changed as well. Where it had once been an engine of growth and employment, it increasingly became a manager of limits. Fiscal responsibility replaced ambition as the dominant virtue. Those who paid the price were unevenly distributed. White-collar sectors adapted more easily. Financial and service industries benefited from stability and openness. Manufacturing regions bore heavier costs. Public sector workers faced prolonged restraint. This imbalance mattered. It fed a sense that economic adjustment was something done to certain parts of the country, not shared equally. Trust eroded slowly, but persistently. Meanwhile, the global environment reinforced the shift. Other countries faced similar pressures and drew similar conclusions. The idea that governments must reassure markets before voters gained traction. Austerity became framed not as a policy choice, but as an unavoidable response to globalization. Britain's experience in 1976 was often cited as evidence. The breaking point, then, was not a single decision, but the normalization of a new rule set. Once accepted, it proved difficult to reverse. Attempts to expand public spending were met with warnings. Inflation fears resurfaced quickly. Currency stability remained a constant concern. Even when conditions improved, caution dominated. This caution shaped the next generation of policymakers. They did not need the IMF to enforce restraint. They internalized it. In hindsight, this was the deal's most lasting legacy. Britain regained stability, but lost flexibility. It avoided immediate collapse, but accepted long-term constraint. It preserved formal sovereignty, but narrowed practical autonomy. Those who benefited most were those positioned to operate within the new framework. Those who depended on public investment, long-term planning, or state-led growth faced enduring disadvantage. The mistake was not seeking help. It was treating the conditions as temporary rather than transformative. By the time that became clear, the framework was entrenched. Austerity had become the default, and with it came a quiet but profound shift in how Britain understood power, responsibility, and choice. The final outcome of that shift would take years to fully reveal itself, but its direction was already set. The last part of this story is not about the crisis itself, but about the legacy it left behind, and how a moment of emergency became a permanent feature of British economic life. The crisis of 1976 did not end with recovery. It ended with adjustment. By the late 1972s, Britain had stabilized its currency, reduced inflation, and restored a measure of international confidence. On paper, the IMF intervention appeared successful. The country avoided default. The immediate emergency passed. But what followed was not a return to the old model. It was a recalibration of what Britain believed it could afford and what it believed it should attempt. The IMF deal quietly redefined responsibility. Economic credibility became the primary goal. Social ambition became conditional. Every major policy decision now carried an unspoken question. How would markets react? That question outlived the crisis. In the years that followed, governments of different political stripes inherited the same assumptions. Budget discipline was treated as non-negotiable. Public spending was framed as a risk to be managed rather than a tool to be used. Even when growth returned, restraint remained. This continuity is important. It shows that the IMF's influence did not depend on permanent oversight. It depended on precedent. Once Britain demonstrated that it would accept external conditions to restore confidence, the logic of those conditions became internalized. The country no longer needed to be told what the limits were. It enforced them itself. This shift shaped Britain's trajectory through the late 20th century. Industrial policy remained cautious. Infrastructure investment lagged. Regional disparities widened. The state's role continued to narrow. Critics argued that this was the true cost of the 1976 deal, not the spending cuts themselves, but the long shadow they cast. Supporters countered that Britain had no alternative, that global finance had changed, and that discipline was the price of participation. That sovereignty in a connected world was always conditional. Both views contain truth. What cannot be denied is that the crisis marked the end of a particular post-war settlement. The idea that Britain could combine expansive social provision, full employment, and independent economic policy without external constraint did not survive 1976. It was not destroyed in public debate. It was set aside in private agreement. That is why the IMF deal remains uncomfortable to discuss. It does not fit neatly into narratives of decline or renewal. It was neither dramatic collapse nor clear betrayal. It was a managed retreat, negotiated, justified, and largely forgotten. Yet its effects continue to shape the present. Whenever debates arise about public spending, debt, or national ambition, the logic of 1976 resurfaces. Warnings about confidence, fear of currency pressure, the assumption that markets must be reassured before voters. These ideas did not emerge naturally. They were learned under pressure. The quiet power of the IMF deal lies in this inheritance. It changed not just policy, but expectations. Britain did not lose a war in 1976. It did not surrender its institutions. It did not announce defeat, but it accepted a new reality, one in which survival required permission, one in which economic choices were bounded by external approval, one in which austerity was no longer temporary, but structural. That is why this moment matters. Because it shows how power can shift without force, how sovereignty can narrow without proclamation, how decisions made in crisis can outlast the crisis itself. The IMF did not trap Britain alone. Britain stepped into the framework willingly because the alternative felt worse, and once inside, it never fully stepped back out. That is the legacy of 1976. Not collapse, not recovery, but constraint quietly agreed, carefully justified, and deeply embedded. A reminder that in modern history, the most consequential decisions are often the ones made when survival feels urgent and alternatives feel impossible. And long after the emergency passes, those decisions remain.